Welcome to the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible, but were afraid to ask. I'm Katie Langston.
And I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker.
And today on the podcast, we have a very special and wonderful guest. Welcome, Eric Barreto. Eric is the Frederick and Margaret L. Weyerhaeuser Associate Professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. That's a bit of a mouthful, but also sounds like an awesome gig. And he's also the co-author of a book called Exploring the Bible with Professor Michael Chan, and is currently working on a commentary on Luke. Yep.
The same book. It's
just half.
It's
of
Acts
it.
Part 1.
The first half.
Acts
right.
Part 1. Yeah, I like that.
Exactly.
It's a prequel.
So welcome, Eric. We're so happy to have you here. Delighted to have you.
Glad to be here, y'all. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. So we are exploring a question today that is really common. I know that I get it a lot, especially when I'm in dialogue with folks who are maybe not Christians, or maybe post-Christian or ex-Christian or something like that. It's a difficult question, and they ask why. Well, and I think even Christians have this question as well. It's not just like a question that others have, but the question is, why did Jesus have to die on the cross? We just celebrated, at least at the time of we're recording it, we just celebrated Easter, and so we've gone through Holy Week and Good Friday and all of that stuff. What was the point of that whole thing, right? That was kind of a bummer. It was a drag.
Yes. Yeah. So it's this huge question that we face, this massive question, and one that the New Testament itself and its authors are wrestling with. It shouldn't make sense, right, to have God's Messiah come, and in the ways that we confess Jesus to be God incarnate, to have God be in our midst, in our presence, and that what our human reaction, is to string up the goodness of God in this public display in this gruesome and cruel death. It kind of doesn't make sense. And I think in the New Testament, you see the gospel authors and Paul himself wrestling with the cross and what sense to make of it. I think, for example, at the end of the Gospel of Mark, when Mark leaves us with this dramatic ending that Jesus, we don't see the resurrected Jesus, but the angels tell the women that Jesus has been resurrected, and they go away afraid over what they've heard. And I think that's probably the right reaction. This is a fearsome, complicated set of questions. And I think the New Testament gives us all sorts of responses, all sorts of answers to that question, why did Jesus die on the cross? And I think Luke gives us a really interestingly distinct response to this question that I've been wrestling with recently, and I'd love to share with you all a little bit more about it. If
Yeah,
that's all right.
that'd be great.
I want to hear it. Sounds awesome.
I think one of the striking things to me in Luke's account is that Jesus' innocence is stressed over and over again, that he didn't do anything to deserve this. People along the way declare that he's innocent. Pride of place goes to the centurion who's at the foot of the cross, who in Mark and Matthew says this man was surely God's son. In Luke, he says, surely this man was innocent. Perhaps even this man was righteous, depending on how we want to translate that term. The centurion there stands apart. So Jesus' innocence is emphasized throughout. Second is both Mark and Matthew will say that Jesus was a ransom payment for many. That there's a sense in Mark and Matthew that when Jesus dies, he functions as a ransom payment, that we've been kidnapped by some force, whether it's a satanic force or an evil force, whatever it is, and that his death is the payment, the ransom payment for our liberation. Luke, we know, has Mark in front of him, and Luke does not include that verse, that allusion to Jesus being a ransom payment. Instead, it's Jesus' innocence that emphasized. The second thing that I think is emphasized in Luke's account is in the reaction of the people when they see Jesus die. So this is in Luke 23. let's start in verse 48. And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home beating their breasts. So the word spectacle is one that is pulled, like I've keep tripping over every time I read it, as many times as I've read it. So here you have a group of people who voluntarily chosen to go out to see a show, to be entertained, to be delighted by other people being killed in this gruesome and public way. And here I think we're tempted to kind of look down upon them and wonder what's wrong with them, when the reality of public executions has been a reality for all kinds of cultures for a long time,
including ours.
Yeah, absolutely. And that in recent memory, and there are memorials to this all throughout the country cropping up now, people used to go out in their Sunday best to go see public lynchings. This is not that strange of an idea. And I think even in more subtle ways, but maybe not so subtle, but pernicious still, is the way that we celebrate a really terrible hit on a football field. They used to be the highlights, right? That we are reveling in someone else's pain. Or when we slow down a little bit to watch that car wreck, there's something about us as humans that loves the spectacle, that loves a show. In this case, the spectacle is Rome displaying its power. We have all the power in the world, even power to take the lives of these people, and again, this gruesome public way. So they come out to see a spectacle, they come out to see a show, but they go away not delighted by what they've seen, but aggrieved and distressed by what they've seen, because they saw an innocent person die. They go away with grief because Jesus should not have died in this way. In that way, I think Jesus' death in Luke is a tragedy of sorts. It's something that shouldn't have happened. And thus, I wonder if this is part of what Luke wants us to imagine, that as we draw near to the cross in Luke's account, we don't celebrate the Lamb of God slain for our sins, as we might see in the Gospel of John, for example, but we see our own complicity in these systems that take the innocent and execute them. Because Jesus is neither the first nor the last innocent person to die at the hands of a cruel empire. So
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please, yeah.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about the manner of execution, the cross, right? Like this is not.
Yeah.
This is an all too common means of execution in the Roman Empire, right?
Yeah.
Like the first century rabbis who aren't talking about Jesus, when they talk about the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22, they say that Isaac carries the wood of his sacrifice just as a man carries his own cross. Yeah. Right? And they're not talking about Jesus there. They're talking about the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who were executed in this way. And you're right, you've said, the spectacle, it's meant to be very public, right? Like a warning. Is that right?
Yeah, it's this visible warning. It's a display of Roman power, but also a visible warning. Don't be like this guy. So very disturbingly common, and how often people would have seen crosses and could have borne witness to this kind of death. And also to remember that I think crosses are often saved for the worst of the worst. And the worst of the worst are those people who disturb the Roman order, who disturb the Roman peace. Yeah. And so part of that spectacle and that thrall is that people come out to see this violence, because if that violence is directed at those people, that maybe it won't be directed at us. The sense that empire's violence, as long as it's directed at someone else, then we're safe, we're free. And then the cross brings us to that moment to say that in those kinds of systems, none of us are free, because we're all vulnerable to empire's whims and empire's violence.
That's really thought-provoking. The power of the empire is such that no one is safe and no one is innocent, perhaps.
Right. Like there's complicity there too.
There's complicity in the empire's. Yeah,
there's complicity in thinking that form of violence can keep the rest of us safe. And I think when they see Jesus die in this way, they see Jesus dying an innocent person's death.
Yeah.
The irony, of course, is that he's neither the first nor the last innocent person to die in this way.
Right.
But there's something about Jesus's death that causes a centurion, who's probably executed a few people in his day,
Right.
and this crowd that maybe has seen a few executions in their day,
Yeah.
that there's something amiss here. There is something wrong. We need some sort of divine intervention to break free from this thrall that we have to violence, but especially to imperial violence.
So correct me if I'm wrong. What I hear you saying is, in Luke, at least, or in Luke's account of the crucifixion, it's not so much, as you say, the Lamb of God sacrificed for the sake of the world, as we see in the Gospel of John, and it's not even so much the ransom given for the sins of many. Now, it may be that, right? It may be that as well. It is that as well. But Luke's emphasis, his particular lens, is this is what empire does, right?
Yeah.
This is what, and the Roman Empire, obviously, but also the empire of sin and death and Satan, right? The unholy trinity, so to speak, that this is what happens when God's holiness, when God's purity, when God's love encounters human sin. Is that?
Yeah, we reject it. We string up that goodness on a tree. Here I'm reminded in Luke chapter 4, when in Luke's account of the temptation, Satan says in the middle temptation, according to Luke, that all the kingdoms of the world and all their glory have been handed over to me, and I give it to anyone I please. There's a sense in Luke's imagination that the empire is bad, but even behind that empire is a power greater than that empire.
Yeah.
And a power that no human army can defeat, an evil that perpetuates and invades every corner of our lives, so much so that we think it's safety, that we think it's a kind of freedom, when it's actually killing the innocent and keeping us chained to this myth that we think that violence can save us.
Peace through strength.
Yeah. Right.
Force.
So the Roman peace is this propaganda, right? The Pax Romana says we have maintained peace so that the economy and all your everyday lives can go on, but that Roman peace is earned at the edge of a sword, and with the constant threat of that violence, in this way displayed publicly for the spectacle for everyone to see. So
the Roman Empire is no more, but right, but this power that you reference from, what was it, Luke 4, or the power of Satan, the power of human evil, underlies all the empires, right? The empires that continue even today, including, to our shame, right? The empire that the United States sometimes, or the imperial power that the United States sometimes wields. I don't want to get into politics, but there are ways in which we are complicit.
We're not disarming our nuclear weapons anytime soon. Right?
Yeah. So one of the ways, I think this is right. This is where things get a little tricky, because it's easier to talk about an ancient empire that's long gone.
Right.
Harder still to imagine the ways that we are caught up in the thrall to imperial violence. So here, our colleague Cameron Howard at Luther, we were doing some work together, and one of the ways we were thinking about teaching about empire is that empire is not some dude on a throne with a great haircut and a Caesar salad, right? Like that's not what it's about. It's this all structuring way of the world that says, this is the way the world is.
Right.
The way the world is one that serves this power and kind of gives you some benefits along the way that you can enjoy. It's this all-encompassing sense of control that says that kind of tries to teach us that death is life and that evil is good, right? And in that way, we can find all kinds of empires coursing through our churches, through our communities, through our politics. So this isn't about, doing a one-to-one correlation between an ancient empire and a singular contemporary empire, but to notice the ways that kind of evil influence can pervade all kinds of places. So for me, and the way I've been trying to teach this text recently to church groups and for my class at Princeton is, I want us, when we read Luke's account of the cross, I wonder if some of the images that might come to our mind are those images of the cross, those artistic representations. But what if that kind of unjust, innocent death is still all around us? So what if that unjust, innocent death is happening when George Floyd had the weight of an empire on his neck? When we were gassing people at the US-Mexico border, people yearning for a new life, at the weight of empire, the fear that if those people come in, we won't have what's due to us. That fear was motivating that tear gas. Or I think there's this picture I saw last month in Ukraine, I think it was in Lviv, where parents had put out empty strollers in this square representing the children who had died in the conflict in Lviv. Say that these innocent people who had nothing to do with what's happening around them were caught in the crossfires of empire, so that some people might feel safe and others might feel terrorized. So that experience that Jesus had on the cross is still with us in really powerful ways.
And I think that's important. It's important that Jesus then brings a kingdom. And again, I think that's something that we don't think about enough, right? Because it's not just that he's bringing, some far off distant promise of, harps on clouds. And that's what the imagination of God's kingdom is sometimes, but it's actually, if you're Eric, if you're talking about, the empire is actually the false alternative power structures that invade our societies and our worlds and in our world, and some are much more brutal than others, right? Like, I don't think you couldn't make a one-to-one comparison to the United States and the Roman Empire, even the United States and Russia. I don't think you can.
No.
They're not the same. And yet those forces are still pervasive. They're still prevalent. And the logic of those forces still, kind of permeates our imagination and our society. And Jesus, in bringing the alternate kingdom, entirely rejects all of those narratives and all of the kind of power structures, and instead says, this is why like the cross is so like mind-blowing, says actually no, the power of God is manifest in self-giving even unto death on a cross.
And that this instrument that Rome uses to torture, to publicly humiliate a people, is the very instrument that Jesus uses and God uses to demonstrate that it wasn't for Rome to take Jesus's life. It wasn't theirs to take, because that life does not belong to them. They think they rule the world. They think the world belongs to them, but it's actually God's power that is greater and mightier. So for us to one, I think that Luke's cross helps us to wonder, in what ways are we bound up in these systems? That we are taught that violence and death are life and power when they're not. When we encounter that, how do we go away grieving over what we've seen, the things that we shouldn't have seen, the innocents who have died? And then how do we turn our imaginations then towards the resurrection power of Jesus? A power that brings life from death. And that it's real life and not the kind of artificial almost life that empire wants to promise us.
Yeah, that's hugely important, because we can't talk about the cross without the resurrection, right? Like if the cross is the end of the matter, then it's hopeless, right?
Bad news.
It's all the innocent.
That's not good news.
That's bad news. But
innocents die, and that's it.
And we know that, right? I mean, we
all know that innocents
die. Yeah. And the innocent suffer, the innocents die. They're the most vulnerable. But I love how you both of you turn that at the end, right? Why did Jesus have to die on the cross? The cross as this symbol of violence and empire and oppression becomes then the sign of self-giving love. And of the power of God expressed in the self-giving of Jesus on the cross. That's why we have crosses on buildings, and we wear them around our necks, and we have them at the front of our churches, right? The symbol of torture becomes then the symbol of love, and of the power of love to bring forth life in the midst of our death dealing ways and our imperial desires, God's power made perfect in weakness, and God's yes to all of what Jesus did and spoke and was, right? God's yes in the resurrection, where death is defeated finally, and Satan is defeated, and sin is defeated.
Yeah, and it's a defeat that's both transformative and that the effects of death linger with us still. So I think about Jesus carrying the signs of that torture on his body and on his resurrected, ascended body,
right?
But also the effect that it had upon Jesus' friends. So to think about those two friends on the road to Emmaus that can't recognize Jesus, probably because they never thought they'd see him again,
right?
Which is rational, and it's as the world has been. To think about the sorrow of Mary seeing her son die in this way, so that the witness of those who were a little further off, I think, is important too. So there are the people who are closer in, who are there for the spectacle. There are also his friends from far away, grieved and traumatized by what they've seen. And those are, I think, important stories for us to tell about the cross as well.
Yeah. And that transformation, I like that word, of not just
Right,
of the symbol of the cross, but of,
well, it's not a bypassing, right? Like that's the thing too that's important about like the notion of like the transformation of the cross and the resurrection. It's like God didn't zap it better, right? God didn't lift the people up to the clouds and the harps, right? Like there's a sense in which I think sometimes as people of faith, even we try to just bypass we bypass it, but transformation actually takes something that is and then changes it. And that's what Jesus does.
Well, again, as with every podcast we do, we could say a lot more, but hopefully
we have
again,
like 7 more hours.
Yeah, sure.
And buy Eric's book when it comes out.
That's right. Look for Eric's book. Exploring the Bible as well, but also his commentary on Luke, which is coming out in the interpretation series. Westminster John Knox, is that the publisher? Yeah. So sometime in the future, where he will talk about this and so many other things about the Gospel of Luke. So, but thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and insight, Eric.
Thanks, friends. Thanks for having me.
It's been really good to talk with you again. And thank you to those listening to this episode of the Enter the Bible podcast. This ends season 3 of our podcast. But there will be a season 4. We will just ask you to stay tuned. We're going to take a bit of a break and then have season 4 with more wonderful guests like Eric Barreto. You can keep an eye on our Instagram page to find out when season 4 will be dropping. But in the meantime, there's lots of other podcasts, including podcasts from back when Eric was the co-host of this podcast when he was here at Luther Seminary. You can find those in the archives at enterthebible.org, along with high-quality courses, commentaries, resources, videos, and reflections. Again, enterthebible.org. Be sure to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app and share the podcast with a friend. Thank you for joining us.